We've got a bit of a climate change roundup this week with our friend Michelle Sterling from Friends of Science, and then we're discussing her side project, wherein she examines the narrative around Indian residential schools here in Canada. I'm Sheila Gunn-Reid, and you're watching The Gun Show. You know, since COVID has receded, we've gone back to the same old emergency, catastrophe. The old thing that they used to use to control your life and where you went and what you could eat and the kind of car you could drive, how far you can get away from your house. That sounds a lot like COVID, doesn't it? And that's climate change. The politicians who were hell-bent on controlling all the comings and goings and your interactions during COVID, well, COVID's gone, and so they have to go back to the old one, climate change. And there are a few different ways that they're using climate change to control your life. And one of those ways is infesting the banking industry with climate hysteria, which will lead, of course, to carbon social credits. And if you think that's just a conspiracy theory, they're already doing this sort of thing to major energy projects. If it doesn't meet climate targets, well, maybe the bank won't finance it. Maybe the insurance companies won't insure it. So it's a bureaucratic prohibition on an already approved project. Neat little thing that they're doing. And then after we discuss that with my friend Michelle Sterling and a whole host of other issues, we're moving into something else that she has been acutely focused on, and that is the facts around Indian residential schools here in Canada. And she's not just a lay person on this issue. She is someone who worked in Alberta history in particular for a very, very long time. And so she's got a lot more expertise than the people accusing skeptics of genocide denial on the issue of Indian residential schools. It's a long show today, so I'll just be quiet. Let's go directly into the interview. This free episode of The Gun Show is brought to you by
my mug. I know, it's pretty cool. So is this hoodie I got on, and you could have it on too if you check out our special website at rebelnewsstore.com. That's where you can see Freedom Focus hoodies that we have for you, beanies, cell phone cases, you name it, all while supporting our journalism, where we fight to bring you the other side of the story, as opposed to, being forced by the Trudeau government to fund leftist media out of your taxes. The truth is, without you and your generosity, there is no Rebel News. So again, if you like the reports that we bring you and that we also fight for freedoms in Canada, please consider doing some shopping, picking up some swag at rebelnewsstore.com. We appreciate your support.
So joining me now is my friend and good friend of the show, Michelle Sterling from Friends of Science. And there's so much to talk about on the climate front, because now that COVID has receded, we've gone back to the old emergency that's going to kill us all, and that's climate change. Michelle, thanks so much for coming on the show. I wanted to talk to you before we get into some other things about, you had sort of made a list of things that you wanted to talk about, but there were some things that I wanted to talk about too. But I noticed this week, and the reason I sort of mentioned COVID is because there's a woman now suing CBC and several levels of government and officers of government because of the propaganda that she fell victim to with COVID. And she ended up with Bell's palsy and severe vaccine injury. And so there are attempts to hold CBC and the government responsible for their bad, flawed messaging there, or at least their messaging that wasn't entirely honest. And I see that you've done a little bit of deconstructing CBC's, what would we call misinformation on another front, and that's climate change. So, and I watched this as you did it. It was a live show deconstructing CBC's propaganda.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, the deconstructing CBC's propaganda. This was about the fault lines report, which also contained a lot of COVID material as well. And basically, the fault lines report was set up by the Canadian Council of Academics or something to that effect, or Canadian Council of Academies. Anyway, a multi-million-dollar organization, basically government funded, and we were the only group picked out by name in it. But, when you go through the CBC report, you see that they're trying a new method of indoctrination and propaganda, which is, telling a story narrative. So, in a way, I feel bad for Jayla Bernstein because, the live stream that we did really takes her to task because, she was not reporting on the story. Instead, she was creating this kind of narrative, storyline narrative to draw people in. And then they put Stephen Lewandowski on screen, and he's a professor of cognitive behavioral psychology. He's the guy who wrote the very famous paper called NASA Faked the Moon Landing, which then he tried to apply to all dissenting climate scientists that they're all conspiracy theorists. So this may be starting to sound a bit familiar to everyone. Anyway, he said almost nothing, but in his interview, and really the fault lines report that Jayla did was not reporting at all. So within that live stream, I did sort of like, what if she had been reporting on actual things in the report? So, have a look at it and see what you think. But yeah, CBC is, not informing the public. They're actively misinforming the public on so many things.
Now, one of the things that I think should have been all over mainstream media, it happened in May, and I didn't see it anywhere except on the Friends of Science YouTube channel. And that was that wind power in Alberta went to near zero. And this was chilling to me because of the federal push for net zero policies. They don't want even fossil fuel backup when it comes to green energy on the grid. And I didn't see this reported anywhere, that there was a complete and total collapse of wind energy in Alberta in late May, except at Friends of Science. Tell us what that would have meant for us. First of all, tell us what happened and what that would have meant for us if there were no such thing as fossil fuel backup for our grid.
Well, it's actually, there was one media report, and that was Brian Zinchuk of Pipeline Online. So he did the first report of it, and then I picked it up and basically read his report as a video message because, it reaches more people and some people don't read. Anyhow, wind collapsed and for many hours. I don't have the stats off the top of my head, but what it would mean for us is if we didn't have the natural gas backup, which we do have, and we're building a couple of 1,000 megawatt more gas generation, and if we didn't have the existing coal, which we do have, if we didn't have the import from Saskatchewan, Montana, and BC, we would have been toast. And the thing is with wind and solar are typically regional phenomenon. So if there's a drop in wind in Alberta, that would be the same in Saskatchewan. And Saskatchewan is also under tremendous pressure to abandon coal and not use any natural gas and to implement a whole bunch of wind. And of course, the theory of the clean grid, which the East-West grid, which is a liberal platform, has been for a long time. It's based on probably on the Danny Harvey paper out of University of Toronto, where he proposed, and note, he's a geographer, he's not a power generation expert, and you can tell when you read the paper, because he thinks that an east-west grid hooking up to hydro in the provinces with lots of hydro and nuclear in Ontario, and wind, mostly like 30% of the wind power, I think, was to come from Alberta, that we would have a very cheap, inexpensive power source. And you're hearing this being repeated by the Clean Energy Canada, the Tides offshoot, by the Climate Institute, And their argument is like, oh, there's so many billions of dollars on the table for the provinces to be subsidized for this. You should just jump in, and then you'll have cheap power. Well, all those billions of dollars of subsidies come from our pockets, so we'll be paying for these subsidies. Not to mention, there's not enough power on the grid right now for the EV policy in Canada. Period. There isn't enough power. So if you're going to be electrifying houses and trying to hook up an east-west grid, I mean, look what happened in Quebec over the Christmas holidays, right? They got flattened by a big storm. And they have problems there now because they have electrified a lot of homes. And they just don't have the capacity anymore. So how can we hope to draw from Quebec's big hydro to Alberta when they don't have enough there? And if the wind goes flat here, we'll all be in blackout. And blackout is not only dangerous for humans, especially in the middle of winter, but it's catastrophically expensive for industry. If you have some manufacturing process, many manufacturing processes have to run 24/7. They are not meant to be stopped. So if you have to stop, then you have millions of dollars of product that's kaput. In hospitals, they do have backup power for probably 3 or 4 days, maybe. But I think a lot of people in Quebec were out for a week or two, right? So it's deadly. It's a very bad idea. It's phenomenally expensive. We've got a number of reports like the true cost of wind and solar for Alberta, clean electricity, delusion or reality. We've got quite a few reports online that help people understand why it's so expensive to do this and why it's so ineffective. So I don't know, there's like a freight train mentality at the top in government at the federal level, and they seem to be unable to understand these very fundamental, important things.
Yeah, and you can watch this stuff happen in real time. There's a Twitter account called Reliable Energy Alberta, I think it's called.
Reliable AB. Yeah.
Yeah, Reliable AB, and it shows you in real time. All it does, it's a bot, and all it does is tweet out what's on the Alberta grid at that moment. And you will see for yourself what an absolute pipe dream green energy is, especially on a cold day. Take a look at that on a cold day or a hot day, and then look at what your life would be like without that fossil fuel backup on the grid. And it's not fossil fuel backup, it's fossil fuels on the grid.
That's right. Yeah, you can look at the Alberta Electric System Operator as well. That's where the data comes from for Reliable AB. And they have a new dashboard, which is also quite demonstrative. You can see the capacity, because that's the other thing that people get confused about. People say, oh, look, we've got 5,500 something megawatts capacity of wind power. Well, we do. Okay, fine. But capacity is not actual generation. Like when it's not generating, we have nothing. It doesn't matter how many megawatts you've built because you don't have any power. So, and at one point last year, there was an article in the Calgary Herald, I think, and they were quoting Blake Schaefer of the University of Calgary. And he was saying, wow, this is great. For the first time in history in Alberta, renewables outperformed coal. Well, we have like 1 or 2 measly little coal plants still running, putting out like 820 megawatts of power. And we had like 5,000 something megawatts of renewables. So the coal was actually doing just 1% less than all these renewables over the course of the year. That's not a victory. That's a failure, a big one.
Well, and of course, at one point, coal is going to be surpassed by green energy. They banned the use of coal for electricity. So, they're phasing it out. So, of course, it's government mandated decline of the coal industry. We have 800 years of pretty clean burning coal under our feet, which seems ridiculous that we're stranding it. But yeah, if the government mandates to phase out of coal, at some point it will be phased out. And I think, unfortunately, for the ratepayer, we're getting there. Before we move on to one thing I want to talk to you about that's very chilling, and that is this climate colonization of the banking industry, both here but also around the world, is an update to Justin Trudeau's flagship tree planting program, which is such a farce because Canada, I mean, we're covered by the boreal forest. I think it's the world's largest continuous forest. And Justin Trudeau's idea was, you know what we need to do? We need to get the government to pay people to plant trees, even though industry already does it for free. So tell us what's going on with the tree planting program and why you think Justin Trudeau announced it in the first place.
Well, it's a debacle, really. And I did a little short video where I'm crawling around in the grass by my little tree that I thought was going to die. And why I'm in the grass there is that most of the trees that they show on the Natural Resources Canada website that they've planted are being planted in very grassy places. And our forestry consultant tells us that, grass will outdistance the tree 10 to 1, like it'll basically kill the tree. And when you plant trees, apparently about 30% of them don't survive. It's just, Mother Nature, doesn't matter how much you tend them, blah, blah, blah. But what's interesting with the tree planting program, they've posted a whole bunch of images of all these different projects that they funded. And what I found very interesting is the money's going out. And then in these reports, they're saying, well, we hired we didn't hire, we got a bunch of volunteers to plant the trees. Well, trees shouldn't cost a lot of money. If you go to a company called Tree Time that's in Alberta, you can get little bundles of seedlings, and I got some this year for a very, very cheap price. And they're frozen, and then you let them thaw out and you plant them, and boom, you have a tree for very, very little money. So the government is paying people hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then those people are getting volunteers to plant the trees. So where's this money really going? And just to let you know, there's another thing that's coming to Alberta, or not to Alberta, to Canada, called the 1 Trillion Tree Org. Well, this is a project of the World Economic Forum, of course, and it's, what's the guy's name? Mark Benioff of Salesforce. It was his idea. They want to plant 1 trillion trees. So they're getting people to be involved in this. Well, really it's a carbon credit project. So if you're a messy polluter, then you can go to some tree planted place and say, hey, why don't I buy your carbon credits? And then we can pretend that I didn't pollute. So I'll pay you some money. And, so it's really just the lack of delivery of an invisible substance to no one, trading hands, picking pockets of the consumer. And I think it's also very dangerous. Like our forestry consultant pointed out a long time ago that, and you can see it in our Burning Questions report about coal in Alberta, that if you have a forest that is dedicated to carbon credits and you have a wildfire, somebody's going to have big liabilities. Now, who's going to pay for all those carbon credits that just poof, not only went up in smoke, but they also created more CO2?
The consumer, always. To answer your question, who's going to pay? Always the consumer. These people just pass their costs along to everybody else. No,
but we're talking like millions of dollars.
Sure. Yes. Before we move on, I want to talk to you about this thing that seems pretty commonsensical, given what we just lived through with COVID, where all the models were wrong, and overblown and overheated and exaggerated and doomsaying. And that's nothing new, actually, because all the models have always been wrong for climate change. And so our premier here in Alberta, common sense kind of lady named Danielle Smith, said, you know what? I don't trust the models that are consistently wrong. And CBC lost their marbles about it.
Yeah, it was on Power and Politics, just a short clip a couple of weeks ago. And of course, the government modeling, and it comes from these ENGOs, of course, that are always trying to destroy our industry anyway. They have projected that there will be almost no demand for oil and gas in the future, especially not from Canada because it's more expensive here, and also that the price of oil will be kaput. But Robert Lyman just did a report for us that summarizes a report that was normally done by British Petroleum. Now they have a consulting firm doing the report. And of course, it shows nothing but that demand for oil and gas is expanding all around the world, and coal. And it's expanding, of course, in all the non-OECD nations. And in the OECD nations, it's pretty much flatlined. But we sell our oil anywhere, right? We could sell it anywhere around the world. So if there's demand, why wouldn't we take advantage of that? It's a huge income earner for the country. So if you're going to phase out oil and gas, what are you going to use to replace that revenue? That's the revenue that pays for healthcare, that pays for big infrastructure projects, that pays for the military, that pays compensation to Indigenous people. Like if we don't have the resource industry working on all cylinders, we don't have that substantial revenue. And it's certainly not going to come from other, things like banking industry or insurance. I mean, all those industries run on oil, gas, and coal. They all need energy. So it's crazy. Anyhow, in the interview, Premier Smith said, she didn't trust the modeling. And of course, Alberta has been an oil and gas producer for decades now. So we have a lot of very smart people in government and industry who know world markets very well, far better than the people at CBC or the federal government, obviously. So, it's hard to know, is it an internal trade war where actually the Eastern oil and gas interests are trying to keep their share of the market because they're not suffering the same kind of blockadia that we are in the West. And, a lot of the groups like David Suzuki Foundation was funded by Power Corp, and Power Corporation's interests are not in Western Canada. They're international and certainly very deeply embedded in China. So, let's just say that I think Premier Smith has her head on right. And the report by Robert Lyman called When the Facts Collide with Climate Alarm makes a lot of sense. So everyone should read that.
I like how CBC is shocked that the developing world might want the same standard of living that the rest of us want. They seemed kind of taken aback by the fact that they might want electricity and autoclaves in their hospitals and cars and public transportation and hospitals,
public
and
sanitation,
water treatment,
fresh water.
Yeah, water treatment. They seemed really taken aback by the fact that the developing world might just leapfrog over those things and just end up with, driving electric cars around their 15-minute cities. Now, I think you just briefly touched on the fact that the OECD countries seem to be flatlining with their oil and gas use. And I think that is, in part, it has something to do with the government's mandating certain lifestyle behaviors for us that drive up the cost of living. And I think the banks are propping that up and the insurance companies are propping that up. And Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of Canada, now the climate czar at the United Nations, has a lot to do with that. This seems to be his thing, is social license in the banking industry. And I find this very chilling because with this push for digital currency and the banks adopting all these climate targets, where does that leave us? Especially, and then, you look at that through the lens of what happened with the Freedom Convoy, where you could just have your bank account turned off because of your politics. Where does it leave us? Are we marching towards you could have your bank account turned off because you drove a little too far and ate a little too much meat?
Yes, I'm sure that we are marching directly toward that, because one of the things that Mark Carney was interested in implementing for many years now is a digital currency. And the theory was that somehow this would stop climate change. Now, of course, imagine that there's some massive supercomputer counting every little thing that you and I buy and use, every place that we go, to make sure that we have a personal carbon ration that is not exceeded. Well, the only way that it makes sense to have this huge supercomputer that's draining all the energy in the world to count every carbon molecule of yours and mine is if they're at the same time limiting every single thing that you use or consume or do. So that is the objective. And I did a presentation for the Alberta Prosperity Project a few months ago, and it was about lockdowns. And it's interesting that in 2016, there was a report written called Deadline 2020. In that report, for the major cities, they were planning that people should only have a 2.9 ton carbon, CO2 equivalent carbon footprint. That's about the level of the people who live in Cuba. So in Canada, we typically have a personal carbon footprint of about 16 tons. So imagine reducing your lifestyle, your heating, your food consumption, your travel to 2.9 tons CO2 equivalent from 16 or 17. So, that would simply be deadly for us.
Well, and to think that this is a conspiracy theory, I mean, it's really not, because this is already happening at the industrial level, right? They deny financing or insurance to major oil and gas projects because they are not complying with whatever the bank has decided the climate targets are, and those seem to be the ones from the UN. So this is already happening to big corporations. It's hard to feel sorry for big corporations, but I feel sorry for the people who work at those big corporations. Those are jobs, those are families. And so why wouldn't they do this to us? We're the little guys.
Well, and the thing is with the big corporations, as we mentioned before, they can either get into the carbon trading markets and pretend that they're not emitting, or they can move offshore, which is why there's been a decline in energy use in North America, because a lot of, and in the other OECD countries, because any energy intensive company has left, like steel manufacturers in the UK left for India. No brainer. And really I have to say that people keep thinking that, this is all about climate change and saving the planet. But actually, what if it is part of the Chinese 100-year plan to take over the world? And we're just playing along with it. Can anyone see it from a geopolitical point of view that if all of the Western countries are being gutted and economically damaged, and one country in the world has a plan called Made in China 2025, and it's a plan that also wants to take over all the rare metals of the world. And they're already doing this to Europe. They're already, using extortion on Europe with regard to the rare metals that China supplies to Europe. So, that will shut down certain forms of manufacturing there. Like, why don't we ever look at this from a geopolitical point of view and say, hey, you know what? Maybe climate change actually is an economic trade war against the West. Maybe we should stop playing this game for a while and sort this out first.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's sort of how I look at the climate change agenda. You look to see who benefits through these policies, to see, really what the war is. And I think of climate change as just one battleground where we don't even realize we're fighting China for global supremacy. Again, I'm going to sound conspiracy minded, but if you look at TikTok, which is a Chinese app, it seems to be rewiring the brains of our young people to make them weaker, stupider, more woke, and more vulnerable. And once you look at, social media, climate change, and the economic, really the takeover of what China's trying to do to the world, they have a 100-year plan. They're fighting a war that we don't even know we're in.
That's right. And not only that, people have to realize that a lot of money from the West is sunk in China. So it's stuck there. So that's a very big lever. Canada Pension Plan was financing coal in China. So I'm sure all the Alberta coal workers who are on the skids now feel pretty good about that. They're financing apparently military equipment in China, which will be used against us. There's another book about China's domination of the pharmaceuticals of the world and how they very cleverly, entered the markets, had a lower price product, ran people out of business in Europe and the US, and created market dominance for themselves. Well, now if you need pharmaceuticals and they're all in China's hands and a conflict breaks out between the US and China, they're going to have a very strong lever on the entire health of all the people in the OECD nations. They've been very clever in their strategies. I don't condone it, but, you have to hand it to them that they've been thinking ahead and we haven't been thinking at all.
Yeah.
So,
we've only been responding.
and oddly, as you mentioned about the banks, Bank of Canada is playing along with all this. They just recently issued a climate risk assessment, and I did a video about it. It's a ludicrous document. They have a whole bevy of people working on climate risk assessments all the time, and they're using an implausible model basis, RCP 8.5, and a woman named Professor Jessica Winkle testified to the U.S. Senate recently. It was this spring, I don't exactly remember, maybe March, that all of the basis for climate change modeling is conflicted. So you have consulting firms hiring IPCC lead modelers to concoct models that support the conclusions of the consulting firm. And in many cases, the firm is McKinsey, the world's largest management firm. Huh. So, and if we recall, who did we have consulting in Canada? Dominique Barton of McKinsey, who was working for $1 a year for the Canadian government, giving them advice on how to proceed for a new clean economy. I wonder who that benefited.
Well, yeah, nobody works for $1 a year. Nobody. So there was payment in kind somewhere else. That's for sure. Now, one of the things, let's just change lanes away from climate change really fast. One of the things that you've been focused on is getting to the truth of the mass graves, which are not mass graves at all in many instances here in Canada. And it's difficult work to do because you're digging through history, but you're also fighting censorship. And, we've heard musings that you should make genocide denialism illegal in Canada. Tell us about some of your work to get to the truth about what happened at residential schools here in Canada.
Well, first of all, I just want to mention this is a personal project of mine. So,
yes. Yeah.
I worked with Dr. Hugh Dempsey on many documentaries back in the 1980s. I spent about a decade of my life in and out of the Glenbow Museum archives. I interviewed hundreds of Southern Alberta pioneers, historians, and descendants of the early pioneers and people who signed treaties. So, in my view, there was no genocide in Alberta. If anything, the Mounties came west and stopped the massacre of the Blackfoot Nation, which was going on by the whiskey traders who really didn't care about anybody. They were feeding them this horrible mixture of strychnine and whiskey and old tea. They were killing people. They were raping and pillaging, literally. The Assiniboine tribe was slaughtered prior to the arrival of the Mounties in the Cypress Hills by the Benton Gang, which came over the border out of the United States. So what people don't realize is, the U.S. was running Indian wars from 1622 to 1924. The cavalry was actively pursuing Indian bands in the United States, corralling them and murdering them. That never happened in Canada. That was not the interaction between First Nations people and the traders in Canada. It was always an economic, convivial kind of arrangement. So we had about 300 years here of if not more, of mutually beneficial trade. And then upon that, the treaties were built. So I think that the problem is that in many First Nations communities, there were a lot of people who died of TB. Or once the family died of TB, the children were sent to a residential school for care. They basically became orphanages. So if you look at it from that community's perspective, those people were missing. They disappeared. The place they went was to a residential school. So, and they would have no reason to come back because there was no family left. They were orphaned. But over time, that element of fact would become lost. Especially if the family was not buried with a headstone on reserve and if no one was there to care for it. And these are very, very difficult times. These are times when everyone was extremely poor. So I think this is where the impression that there are thousands of missing and buried children who have no documentation comes from. Because for people living on reserve or in a community, of course, there are these people who vanished. But if you look into the archival records, you find that there is very good documentation of who the person was. And yes, they were given a number, yes, but that's so that all of their laundry could be done and tracked and all of their documents could be done and tracked. It's just the file number. It's not like at Auschwitz. It was never tattooed on anyone's arm. But you find that the documentation is very good. You know the person's name, their family name, their age. A lot of the children who came into care came in at age 4, 5, 6. This is all underage according to the government regulation. The only way they would come into that care is if they were orphaned, destitute, or the family requested aid, or the Indian agent requested aid if the family, say, was dysfunctional to save the life of the child. So then you have medical records for the child entering as well. They were examined before being entered into the school to see whether or not they had TB. That was the main thing to look for. And if they needed any kind of medical treatment. And then if, sadly, the child died, there is a death certificate. If they died at the school, there was an inquiry. Statements were issued to the parents. And it may be that in some instances, people did not get the message in a timely way because some of the parents had their children intentionally put into residential schools because they're working on a trap line. They're going out hunting. That was their occupation. So it's much easier if your children are cared for and you're out in the bush. I mean, there's a really sad story. I don't know if I can find it off the cuff. There's a very sad story here in Eric Bay's book where he talks about, this is up at Moose Factory. And he said a father had come to the post at Albany to report there was no food in the tent. His wife was ill. While at the post, he took ill and he died. So the Hudson Bay Company manager sent out a couple of men with grub. And when they got to the tent, the mother was dead with 5 children around her. The youngest was a babe of 2 months was taken in by a relative. The eldest was a boy of 16. He went with another relative to hunt, and the other 3 children came to the school. The youngest of the 3 died while at school during a flu epidemic. So, imagine that. This is a story that happened more than once. But all of those people were now missing, right? In the minds of the community, they're missing. We don't even know if that orphan baby grew up knowing that its own mother had died. We don't know how the son, the 16-year-old son, how would he remember that? He would remember that his siblings went to residential school and never came home. It's a very complex history that we have, and it's being swept away with the theme of genocide, as if all of these people who died were intentionally murdered. And that's really the fundamental thing about genocide. There has to be an intent to wipe out a population. Well, why would you build a residential school and staff it and bring food and organize events for hundreds, thousands, 150,000 children? Why would you do that if your intention was to wipe them out?
Yeah, it's all portrayed very black and white in all of this, that this was entirely bad and there was no good. There weren't people with good intentions in all of this. And it is, as Woke Watch Canada writes, quite likely will lead to a balkanization of Canada. And we've seen this. I mean, it's becoming like this every Canada Day, where now you can't celebrate Canada Day because of the history of residential schools. There's a push for reparations to be paid now to survivors of residential schools, but not just survivors, families, communities, people who are by and large not even affected by residential schools. I am concerned that it will fracture our country in a way that I think is both unfair and possibly irreparable.
I think that you're right. I think that real possibility exists. And I think there's 2 things that people should read. One is, this just came out on June the 20th, and it's the Justice Department's action plan for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to implement this act. And basically it requires that everything in Canada now be aligned with UNDRIP, as it's nicknamed, and be Indigenous-led. And the other thing people should know is that this is from the Fraser Institute by Dr. Tom Flanagan, that the reparations or compensation now being planned is in the order of $60 billion. So, people are being recognized for their statements of claim. However, people should also know that none of the recollections which are written in the Truth and Reconciliation reports were ever cross-examined. These are statements from people who, in some cases, stand to gain $125,000 in compensation. So, never subjected to cross-examination, no evidence per se was required. So, it's problematic because the entire country is being made to feel guilty of genocide when there's no evidence of genocide, when, as Terry Glavin wrote in one of his articles, The Year of the Graves, he wrote that most of the claimed mass grave sites or unmarked grave sites were grave sites that were already well known to the local First Nations communities. So, all of a sudden they all started popping up in the news as if no one ever knew there was a graveyard there or that there were unmarked graves. Well, yeah, everyone knew. So why did it become a media phenomenon? What is the end goal here? And I think one of the end goals actually does go back to the climate change issue, and that's nature-based solutions. So, excuse me, just let me get a drink here. The whole nature-based solutions thing is the idea of, again, selling carbon credits on pristine, untouched forestry, water, blue carbon, wetlands, and supposedly that all the young people, rather than becoming doctors and scientists and astronauts, would go back to being land keepers, land guardians, water guardians, fire watchers, in sort of a quasi-traditional knowledge keeper way. Now, of course, there are some traditional knowledge aspects that are important to communities, they're important to development, and they should be respected. But, we're basically creating an apartheid situation with this document that is more or less kind of the Garden of Eden, noble savage view of Indigenous people. When, if you look at the residential school history, you find that the residential schools were turning out successful farmers, successful ranchers, successful managers, authors, artists, nurses. There's a whole record of people who came out of Indian residential schools who are very, very competent. And actually, many of the leading figures, even in the reconciliation thing, are people who graduated from residential school. And, if you look and you see, most of the population of Indigenous people in Canada can speak English to one degree or another, often very good. Well, that's a product of schooling and enculturation. So, it's not like people didn't get some kind of a benefit. Anyway, if we have 632 distinct bands in Canada, and over 50 languages, if this is going to lead the country, then we are definitely going to be balkanized.
And I don't want to gloss over the fact that there were problems with residential schools. Some people did some terrible things, but I don't believe in collective guilt. If there are people who must be held responsible, even posthumously, let's do that. But we can't do that without a real, fulsome examination of what really happened at these residential schools. And we've never done that. And the resistance is not coming from outside, it's coming from within. And I'm very curious as to why that might be. For example, at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, there has been no excavation there. And they're telling me this is the site of a major genocide. If that's a crime scene, I want it investigated, and I want the people responsible to be named for eternity. But we're not doing that. And to say that there are no organizations capable of doing the heavy lifting there, you know what? The United Nations, for all of its flaws, it does a pretty good job investigating genocide. And why haven't they been called in? Why hasn't anybody been called in to deal with this?
Well, actually, Jose Francisco Calitze, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Human Rights, he has been here. He has been investigating human rights violations, which would be fundamental to the future investigation that may happen, because China has accused Canada of genocide. So that should trigger a UN investigation. But, my problem with that is that it was a group of terror bloc countries, and Terry Glavin is the person who brought this to everyone's attention. The charge was made the day after UNDRIP was received royal assent in Canada, which to me is rather suspicious, and about 3 weeks after the Kamloops discovery hit the news. It's problematic if you have a nation that actually had a real genocide where they caused the death of about 40 million of their own people under Mao in the Great Leap Forward by starvation, by famine. it's problematic if that's the accuser of Canada of genocide. I think it's a very complicated issue, and our MPs in the House of Commons have complicated it further because last fall on October 27th, they all voted unanimously that Indian residential schools were an act of genocide. There was no debate, nothing. They just passed it in like 2 minutes. So, there's no evidence for it, but we've accused ourselves. And it's going to be pretty hard to backtrack on that one, I think.
Yeah, and we've got China, who is actively engaging in a real genocide against Muslim, Uyghurs, and Christians, accusing us of genocide because we've accused ourselves of genocide. We can't say the Chinese are wrong about us because they voted in the House of Commons.
That's it.
Michelle, before I let you go, because you've been very generous with your time, as always, you've started your own Substack, and I want to give you a chance to promote it because it does something that I think is so necessary in all of these debates, and it's hopeful. And we're so inundated with doom and gloom when it comes to climate change or COVID or the next pandemic, or how apparently we're a genocidal state. We're the worst people on the face of the earth, according to China. Your Substack does the opposite.
Well, I call it the climate of hope. So I basically am really heartbroken over what's happened with our young people, especially, but with many other people who feel this, dark cloud over their head all the time. Whenever there's a disaster like the wildfires or whatever, it's always amped up into, climate change. And this is the new normal. It's always going to be like this. You're always going to be running from wildfire. And that's just not true. So I'm going to try and post some, informative items, something on the lighter side, and just try and help people climb down from that tree of fear. A lot of people are like kittens up a tree where they're terrified and they're stuck there. So I want to try and tempt them to come down the tree and, have a nice warm bowl of milk and some crunchies and curl up and feel safe and comfy. So that's my goal. So I just started it, so there's not much posted there yet, but thank you.
I think it's much needed. I think it's much needed, though, when you flip on the TV or, your Twitter account even, and it's just nonsense. There's nothing climate change can't do to kill you, apparently, if you get all your news from the mainstream media. And it's just so outrageous. It's like, is climate change giving you an earache? Is climate change making the ticks bite you? And I wish I were making up the things I just said, but those are recent articles that I've read. Is climate change making you fat? Is climate change giving you heart disease? It's nonstop.
And the person to follow for all these ridiculous headlines is Dawn TJ90, DAWN TJ90 on Twitter, because she's got a fantastic gallery of memes where she just stuck together all these different headlines that are conflicting and ridiculous. And, that if you read a few of those, it completely ends your climate fear right there.
And again, before I let you go, let people know how they can support Friends of Science, because you are just this little tiny, scarcely funded group up against the deep pockets of foreign funded environmentalists and the United Nations and the World Economic Forum. You're trying to cut through the garbage to advocate for more reasonable policies and sensible debate on these issues.
Well, you can go online to friendsofscience.org. You can join us, become a member, you can donate, or you can just send a donation by e-transfer to contact@friendsofscience.org. We're entering our 21st year of operation, so $21 would be a nice birthday present. I did want to mention we are going to have a live event in the fall. So it's called Break Free from Climate Tyranny. And you can see that on our main page on our website. And there's also an event page. So we're doing early bird ticketing right now for that. So have a look at it.
Very exciting. Those events, your live events, are great, and the food is great, and the conversation is great, and the speakers are always really excellent. And it's just good to get back out in person after 3 years of no events whatsoever.
Right.
Michelle, thanks so much for coming on the show. We'll have you back on again very, very soon.
Thank you, Sheila. Have a good day, everyone. And don't let the climate fear get you down. There's hope.
This free episode of The Gun Show is brought to you by
Adam Sos here for Rebel News. You know, our company is growing quickly, and we'd actually like for your company to grow too. That's why this ad space that I'm speaking through right now is actually available for you to purchase. So instead of people listening to me, they could actually be learning about your company, learning about your business. If this interests you, if this is an opportunity you'd like to capitalize on, send us an email at ads@rebelnews.com.
Well, friends, we've come to the portion of the show where we invite your viewer feedback. It's why I give out my email address right now. It's sheila@rebelnews.com. Put gun show letters in the subject line so I know that your feedback is not just generalized hate mail, but specifically to the show that I'm doing. And last week's letter comes to me by way of somebody named Micah. And Micah writes, "Hi, Sheila. Big fan of your show here. Keep up the excellent work." I definitely will, as long as Ezra will have me. "I have an idea for a show or perhaps a series of shows because the subject matter deals with Atlantic Canada. It may not be your wheelhouse necessarily, but maybe it would be of interest to one of Rebel's Eastern-based journalists." We don't have a ton of Eastern-based journalists, but I have a strong interest in Eastern Canada just because of where I live. And you would think, why would an Albertan care about what's happening in Eastern Canada? But we have so many of you Easterners here that at my little small town grocery store in Fort Saskatchewan, we have an aisle. Our ethnic food aisle is actually maritime food. so like we have your weird brands of crush and the big logs of bologna and salted fish and all those things that make you people feel at home here. And so we're glad to have you. And, you know, our pubs are often Atlantic kitchen style pubs, again, because there are just so many of you here. And, you know, as they say, Fort McMurray is the largest town in Newfoundland. So a lot of you guys here. And I'm very interested in what happens there, but also how, you know, that sort of the attacks on your industry here led you, the attacks on your industry there led you here, and then now they're attacking our industry here. So things to consider. "I'm currently on vacation in Newfoundland." Oh, lucky. "It seems like almost everyone I talk to here has their own version of how and why the fisheries were shut down. Same thing with certain energy projects. Maybe this has been done before, but I think it would be interesting to see a post-mortem play-by-play on all the events and political moves that led to the demise of the key industries in this province. Thank you for your time and for the work that you and the entire Rebel team do every day. Warm regards, Micah." You know, Micah, that's a very interesting proposition. Something I would seriously consider because I can see how those sort of government overreach, government control on certain key industries there caused problems in those industries and then drove people, like I said, out to the West, where now government control is doing the same things to the new industries, which employ those fun-loving Easterners. And yeah, there's a lot of different versions of the story. And I think there will always be a lot of different versions to every story. You know, how did Alberta end up basically underwater in the 1980s thanks to Trudeau? There are a lot of different moving parts there. But, you know, very interesting. And I think a very big part of Canadian history that is often overlooked just by the nature of demographics. So that there are not a lot of people on the East Coast in some of those communities that ended up just basically destroyed by the collapse of the fishery, the way that we're seeing communities out here in the West destroyed by the government mandated collapse in the coal industry. But also just because they're so far away. they're just so darn far away that, not to say that we forget that they exist. It's hard to forget they exist when you're in Alberta and there's so many Easterners here, but they're just far away. It's like talking about a town in the far north. You don't often do that just because it's so far away from the center of the universe, Toronto. So yes, thank you for the idea, and I will seriously consider it when I'm not doing a million other projects at the company, but there's always time for one more, isn't there? Well, everybody, that's the show for tonight. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see everybody back here in the same time well, it might not be in the same place. I'm touring the documentary this week, but from wherever I'm filming. Don't let the government tell you that you've had too much to think.